So there are almost 2,000 prisoners in South Africa's jails who cannot afford bail of less than 1,000 rand. This is according to the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services, which is looking at a bail funds system similar to that of the United States in a bid to reduce overcrowding in the country's prisons. Inspecting Judge for Correctional Services Edwin Cameron joins us now to discuss the privately sponsored feasibility study he presented to Parliament's Justice Portfolio Committee. Justice Cameron, thank you very much for your time this morning. What was the big idea, or rather what prompted this move? What did you see that you wanted to set right?
Good morning, Dudu. Lovely to be with you and to be with your viewers this morning. Thanks for your question and for the opportunity, Dudu. It depends how far back we want to go. I'd like to start by saying that we've got a terrible and increasing crime problem in South Africa. We've also got a prisons problem. We incarcerate, we lock up more people than any other country in the entire Africa, and our proportionate figures show that we are way over the mean in Africa. So we've got overcrowded prisoners, and 1/3 of our prisoners, the people that we lock up, are awaiting trial detainees. These are people who have not been found guilty. Now, it's a subclass of those, Dudu, that we are interested in. There are people whom magistrates have looked over, they've had the investigating officer, they've had the prosecutor look them over, and the magistrate has granted them bail. The magistrate says, I appreciate you're not at flight risk, you're not going to run away, I appreciate you not going to interfere with state witnesses, you're not going to commit more crimes, you've got an address, go out on bail. But there are thousands of people who can't afford. Now, Dudu, you rightly mentioned in your intro the most appalling figure. And when you say 2,000, that's only the people that our prison monitors at the inspectorate, the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services, have been able to count. We've counted almost 2,000, just shy of 2,000. There may be many more if we were able to do a proper count across the country. People who require only 1,000 rand bail but cannot afford it. So the idea, Dudu, is that we get a private fund going that will, on certain conditions, with careful consideration of what crimes, what people, what locations, will advance that bail and then take it back when the person is either acquitted or convicted. As you've said, Dudu, this is a very important point. It's at feasibility study. We got a generous grant from the Bertha Foundation, which is a South Africa-focused, created by South African in London, Mr. Tony Tabatsnik. And they also fund a very important institute at UCT called the Bertha Institute. And Monica Rossi from the Bertha Institute is doing this feasibility study for us right now. So I promised the parliamentarians, and I will make the same promise to the National Prosecuting Authority, the police, the judiciary, that we will carefully hear views from across the whole spectrum so that we don't mess this one up.
Sure. Justice Cameron, you speak of carefully hearing views, and already opinion is divided as we're still embarking on this feasibility study. A number of questions pop up, like what kind of offences will be considered, and so taking a look at who qualifies or who will be disqualified from receiving this help.
Very good point, very powerful point. So I told the Parliamentary Committee on Friday morning that it may be that we come to the conclusion, once we've had Ms. Rossi's study from her and her colleagues at UCT's Bertha's Institute, that we may exclude domestic violence, gender-based violence. We haven't got to that point yet, but all of that is on the table.
Justice Cameron, please help us understand. You mentioned that 1/3 of the prisoners are awaiting trial. And so is this an affordability issue, or is it also quite problematic that you've got people awaiting trial? And why are we finding that people are awaiting trial for more than 2 years in South Africa?
You put your finger on it. Let me first say just quickly that some people are in jail because their families don't want to vouch for them. And I'm not condemning those families. They say our son or our brother or our father or our spouse comes home and steals the money, goes out for drugs. I've heard stories like that. So some people say, no, let him stay in prison. But that's a minority of people. So it is mostly an affordability issue. And we call them, and in our annual reports at JICS and to the Parliamentary Committee on Friday morning, I call them prisoners of poverty. It is a shameful thing, Dudu, and I told the committee this, that we have people who should be able to exercise their basic entitlement to await trial without being inside because they aren't a danger, all those conditions that I mentioned earlier, but they can't afford it. And that's the shameful thing. So the bail fund that we may set up, depending on the findings of the feasibility study, will be privately funded. We're not quite sure how it will be funded. I might also mention that a major benefactor here is Mr. Robbie Brosen, from one of the founders of Nando's, who's been very interested in penal issues, and an associate of his, Rabbi Michael Katz. So we've got powerful people who are thinking this thing through with us. But what we agree on is that it is a shameful thing that someone like me, who's got a bit of spare cash at the end of the month, could pay my way out of awaiting trial conditions. And we hope, as a side benefit, to alleviate, if we could give all those 2,000 plus people who have bail of under 1,000, whose families don't want them to stay there, if we could release them now, we would appreciably, not problem-solvingly, but appreciably reduce the overcrowding. The worst conditions, and the National Commission and his staff recognize this, are in the remand sections of our prisons. And I've been there, I've go there again. I can only use that powerful word again. I don't wish to condemn the prison system because they're dealing with a problem that we have created, judges and legislators. It is shameful, the conditions in which most awaiting trial prisoners are kept. So we can alleviate that. That's what we want to do.
Justice Cameron, when you're saying they're dealing with a problem that you created, just judges and justices, what does that mean?
It means that we made a terrible mistake, Dudu, and I'm very glad you asked that question. All of us, I was a judge in 1998, 1999. We introduced minimum sentences. Compliments of Mr. Johnny DeLong, and I'd like to mention him. I hope that Johnny's listening this morning. He was a very powerful figure on the Justice Committee in Parliament. Terrible mistake. We followed Bill Clinton's presidency in the United States. We followed the so-called new Labour government in the United Kingdom. Tough on crime, long sentences, lock them up, throw away the key. It's a terrible mistake. We've ended up having more prisoners, as I mentioned, than anywhere else in Africa, both in absolute numbers and proportionately to our population. We've ended up with these, as I said carefully, shameful conditions of remandees awaiting trial. So I was a judge. We were all scared of crime 5 years ago, and we made a mistake. So as part of the judicial and legislative and political elite, I hold myself responsible. I'm not pointing fingers at other people, but we've begged the Parliamentary Committee, and we've started a process with them to rethink what things do we criminalize. Do we criminalize drugs? If I may continue just on that moment, I want to make an important allusion. Former President Kgalema Motlanthe says the war on drugs, which involves criminalizing them, has been a catastrophic failure. So I think he's right. We should rethink our approach to drugs. Doesn't mean that you want drugs in the country. You regulate them. You treat them like alcohol and smoking as a public health issue. Sex workers, we've just had that debate. Minister Ronald Lamola has introduced a very powerful short statute. Why are we still terrorizing women who are earning money through a difficult and sometimes dangerous job? We shouldn't be criminalizing them. So there's a whole debate that we should be having about what we're criminalizing, sentence length and parole. All of these are difficult issues. And we're not pretending at the inspectorate that we've got all the answers, but we want to move towards finding answers with our justice system partners.
Yeah, because also criminalizing people, I think in my very simple thinking, there's the obvious, right, where you know this deserves the harshest punishment possible, and then there's some instances when you speak of what to criminalize. Of the 150,000 detainees that we have in South Africa, those who are awaiting trial and cannot afford it, what are they arrested for? For instance, maybe I go to COVID-19 during the height of the pandemic, where you saw people who were selling fruit being put in police vans. I can't forget the picture of an auntie who had a bucket of acha, who had her wares confiscated from her. So you find that, perhaps you explain it for us, please, Justice. You know, what kind of people are we finding that should not be in the system but are trapped in the system?
You've got a too acute and vivid memory. The bizarre, paradoxical thing that we are trying to ensure the safety of the country by telling people that they must socially distance, and then we stick them into an awaiting trial cell with 50 other people where they're exposed to all sorts of pathogens, not just COVID, but tuberculosis and sexually transmitted diseases. So thank you for remembering that. It was a terrible mistake, a mistake that comes from our country's history of over-criminalizing and over-sentencing. It's a history that goes back to apartheid, and we haven't shot ourselves yet of that history in our democracy. Having said that, though, Dudu, let me say that some people have to be locked up. There are terribly dangerous people who want to escape, who want to commit further crimes after conviction and sentencing. I'm not a prison abolitionist. I think some people have to be locked away for a very long time. If you're my generation, you'll remember the film Hannibal Lecter. I call it the Hannibal Lecter effect. There are some people who are terrifyingly dangerous and deserve to be locked up for a very long time. But they're a minority. And now we're treating everyone convicted, even of fraud, non-violent crimes, minimum sentences. Why would you have a minimum sentence of 15 years for certain kinds of fraud, counterfeiting, embezzlement? So we got onto a wrong path, and we are so busy trying not to drown that we don't step back and say, let's learn to swim. Let's get ourselves on the right path. And JICS is trying to do that together with a lot of other people who are helping us and who want to see effective crime containment, effective diminution of crime, effective administration of justice, policing, CID, crime intelligence, and all those things are important, but not the wrong turn of over-sentencing and over-incarceration and sentence inflation.
Justice Cameron, maybe in closing up the conversation, maybe let's speak about rehabilitation. I perceive there might be some resistance from some sectors of society to this proposal, mainly maybe when you think of perhaps sexual offenders, people who are let out on bail and they go back and they do the same thing, suggesting that there's been no rehabilitation or a will at least to rehabilitate. And so even with people who cannot afford the minimum prescription of bail, are we thinking about when they are released, when they are sitting at home, sort of like remedial action to make people think about the severity of the situation, that if you go beyond this mark, there's actually no going back?
Very good point, Dudu. But remember that these are people whom the investigating officer, the prosecutor, and the magistrate have all given careful thought and consideration to. These are people, the only people we're speaking about right now. You raise a broader point about rehab, and we can come back to that if you like. But for the moment, we are talking only about awaiting trial remand prisoners who are not a danger of reoffending, not going to run away like the Bushiris to Malawi. They're going to stand their trial. They're going to come back to court. They're not going to fiddle around with witnesses or with other people. So it's that category. And there can be no sound argument against releasing them with other people's money if they don't have the money themselves.
Enough. I think I'll park the rehabilitation issue and just maybe get your overall thought. The crime statistics were released on Friday, and so you spoke about how you reacted to, or you rather modeled the Bill Clinton approach, because there's this fear of crime which still lingers in the air in South Africa, especially when the number of sexual offences has gone overboard. Just maybe also digressing away from the proposed bill and the feasibility study. The police minister spoke of socioeconomic conditions in South Africa. He mentioned poverty. He mentioned a lack of employment. He mentioned the mushrooming of informal settlements in South Africa. And so when we are responding to crime, do we also need to take a look at the development agenda of South Africa?
Definitely, Dudu. It's part of a bigger picture, but I want to make just one narrow point. Our crime actually came down. Violent crime in South Africa came down from 1994 until 2011. 2011 was the year, 2 years after former President Zuma took power, in which he had effectively dismantled the NPA with crooked, incompetent, and inappropriate appointments, the National Prosecuting Authority. But the narrow point I want to make is one about crime intelligence. In my view, as someone who sat on the bench for a long time and sat in criminal courts, not that I'm an expert, but I'm entitled at least to have a view on this. You start with crime intelligence. Crime intelligence is the most important thing. Who's stealing the copper cables? We know there's a massive network. It's not the guy who's often arrested. It's not the so-called kingpins that they put on trial in Western area a few months ago in connection with the Zama illegal mining operations. The kingpins are elsewhere. They can be traced with proper crime intelligence. The stripping of our Transnet rail system, copper cables, cash in transit heists. There's a whole series of violent robbery and murder-related crimes that we can manage effectively. The sale and transshipment of illegal firearms. Now, what former President Zuma did, and I was once controversial at a previous meeting with the Parliamentary Committee on Justice and Correctional Services. And one of the members, Ms. Jele, very fairly said to me, let's not politicize this before this committee. But I'm again respectfully entitled to my view. 2011, President Richard Zuma, he puts in charge of the Hawks and of crime intelligence people who are convicted criminals now, like Mr. Richard Mbuli. And what happens to state security and to crime intelligence? They are looted. So it's quite a long diversion, Dudu, and thank you for letting me share it with your viewers, because we have to start with effective crime intelligence. The second step is effective CID, detective work. We need effective detective work. Then come to my department as a former judge. We need effective prosecution and far quicker turnover rates in the courts. So all of us are failing the public, but there is a program, there is a way, a step-by-step way that we can practically get to grips with the wave of crime. I think we're something like, how many murders a day? Is it 57? It used to be 57. It's more now. 37,000 a year. Divide that by 365, you'll see it's a terrifying number, closer to 100 or more a day. But we can do something about it. We've got the means, we've got the capacity, we need the leadership and the determination.
Justice Cameron, thank you very much for your indulgence speaking to us about the bail funds system, which is at feasibility study phase. Looking forward to seeing how it develops. Thank you.